My next question is, are North Koreans allowed to go to websites outside of the DPRK like Chinese citizens? If yes, are they advised to use a VPN?
So this is a really interesting question, and it's something that I think is kind of shifting a lot, particularly in recent years. So I'm going with the information I have, but I'll add the caveat that, like, I think this is part of one of the things about the DPRK that's the hardest to know from the outside. And so part of the reason is because the DPRK has an infranet, not internet. By that I mean it's not connected to the wider global internet system. And the reason for that is, very similar to why, countries like China have the Great Firewall, or why, like Cuba, was not permitting the use of like certain social media sites for a while. And it's because these global telecommunications are dominated by the US, right? It's US companies, it's US technology, it's US infrastructure in terms of like
True.
the fiber optic cables that are running everywhere. So the DPRK, has sought to create their own system, and that's, both to guard against information warfare, but also cyber warfare. An example of that is, I think in the Bush or Obama years, there was something called the Stuxnet virus, which was developed by the US and Israel to specifically attack the DPRK and Iran, right? So they're not just like being paranoid here. They are responding to like a real threat environment, right? Which they have experience with. That's good.
Okay. Good to have you with us today. Nice to have you, and welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, James. Big fan of your work, and also of everything that the Revolutionary Blackout Network is doing. So happy to be here, and happy to be part of this important conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Now, as far as I know, you've been speaking out really against the capitalist system for some time now. I've been noticing a lot of your tweets, and you actually have some really great takes, especially what's going on within our country. As far as the system here, I know this isn't one of my questions, but I was kind of thinking, is the United States everything that that they say North Korea is? Is it kind of like that?
Well, I think, that's a fair place to start. Let's think about what the US says about North Korea or the Democratic People's Republic, DPRK. The narrative is that it is a repressive prison state, that, there is a ruling class that dominates the entirety of society, that it's a country that is expending all of its money on its military capacities at the expense of its people. But if we take any single one of those statements and apply them to the United States, I think we'll also find that they hold a lot of water, right? We know for a fact that in the US today, there is very little opportunity for class mobility. If you are not born into the wealthiest sector of the population, you are very unlikely to rise to that level. We know that money plays a huge role in politics. Corporations can exercise political rights as if they were individuals. And that means that they can leverage billions of dollars to manipulate the electoral system in a way that you and I just can't do, right? And then, of course, let's not even get started on the prison system in the United States, right? I mean, we've been hearing horrific things, particularly in the last few weeks coming out. There's lawsuits in Alabama against forced labor in prisons. There's a situation you just described in Florida where the police are apparently making and selling crack cocaine. This is the first time I'm hearing about it, so I don't know much about the specifics of what's going on there. But I think, we can certainly say that the US is in its own right a repressive society that expends way too much money on the military, where the freedoms of everyday people are severely restricted and limited. And, I think that a lot of what the US does say about the DPRK is not only about serving its geopolitical ends, but also ultimately about projection, right? It's about telling the people of the US, you've got to be so grateful for everything that you're stuck with here, because it could be so much worse somewhere else, right? And I think that is a narrative and a mentality that you'll encounter among lots and lots of people here in the United States. So I'm sure that folks will know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so very much for that. Now, my first question is, and that was kind of a bonus question, but my first question is North Korea, which is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, is that a democracy? And if so, then how are their elections done and system of government set up?
I think that's a great question. I think it's one of the most important things to understand about the DPRK, which is the intricacies of its political system. Now, I would classify the DPRK system as democratic. And the reason for that is, what does democracy mean? It essentially means rule by the people, right? This is something that is enshrined in the constitution of the DPRK. It's reflected in the political processes of the DPRK and the organization of its society. Does it look like the US's democracy? No. And I think that is a point of major contention and confusion, because there is sort of an assumption that if a country is democratic, that means that it has to have either the kind of US style Jeffersonian system or the British parliamentary style of democracy, which are probably the most common that you'll find throughout the world today. But because the DPRK is a socialist country, it does operate in some different ways. And in order to kind of get into describing the system and the democracy there, I first want to take a little bit of detour through history. The DPRK was officially founded in 1948. That's 3 years after the end of World War II and the end of Japanese colonialism in Korea. But the origins of the DPRK's political system actually go back to the end of colonialism, when Korean people were establishing people's committees throughout the peninsula to exercise self-governance. Now, in the South, what ended up happening was that the US military imposed itself and actually abolished the people's committees. They declared them illegal, and they got rid of them through very repressive and violent means. But in the North, that's actually not the process that happened. The people's committees continued to be the fundamental basis of the political system, and in turn they became sort of the seed that then became the Democratic People's Republic of Korea 3 years later in 1948. Now, as part of the People's Committee's governance in Northern Korea at the time, one of the first things they did was hold local elections beginning in 1946. And these were actually the first free elections in Korean history that were based on the principle of universal suffrage and the secret ballot, which are taken as, kind of the most basic thing you need to have in a democracy, right? Everybody gets one vote. Your vote isn't something that's made public that can then be coerced to be changed, things of that nature. And I want to share an excerpt from a US journalist, Anna Louise Strong, who was in North Korea in this time. And this is from a book of hers called In North Korea, First Eyewitness Report, that was published in 1949. The context of this is that she was talking to a woman who was a minor in her community about the political process that was underway and the elections that had taken place. Now, something that Anna Louise Strong, the US journalist, took issue with was that there was only one candidate. And this is something that surprises a lot of people about the electoral process in the DPRK, but I'm going to explain the way that it works. But to quote the woman that Anna Louise Strong was interviewing, this was her response. She said, quote, "We all knew the candidate. We all liked him. We all discussed him. The political parties held meetings in our minds and factories and found the people's choices. Then they got together and combined on the best one, and the people went out and chose him. I don't see what's wrong with this or why the Americans don't like it. I don't see what the Americans have to say about it anyway." And I think that kind of gets to the fundamental difference in terms of how these elections work, right? In the United States and in a lot of other capitalist countries, you have competitive elections where different parties will pose a candidate that are supposed to represent different platforms, different agendas. And then the election is the process by which a determination is made, and there's sort of a political struggle that happens in terms of what actually reflects the best interests of the society, or really in most cases who has the most money and is able to effectively convince the most people to vote for them, right? But in a socialist state, the society and government are organized through the party and through mass organizations. That's something that's really important to understand. So what that means is that functionally everyone has a daily role in political life. So if you're a young person, you are part of your local youth association. If you're a worker, you take part in managing your workplace with your coworkers. And all or most of these organizations have some relationship to the Workers' Party, which is the ruling party. But the Workers' Party itself is composed of millions of members. About 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 people in the DPRK are part of the Workers' Party of Korea. So this is a very, very different system fundamentally than what we have in other countries. For instance, I think a lot of us would be hard pressed to name someone we know on a personal basis who is part of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. And I don't mean that in the sense of knowing a Democratic or Republican voter. right? Being a registered voter is very, very different than being a cadre of a party who is embedded in the decision-making process and the political processes of a political organization, right? That's just not the way that these parties work in the United States, right? It's a very, very small clique of people. They don't have these connections to these wider organizations that represent a massive society. And so the way that it works is just different. And so what that means is that, yes, the elections are not necessarily competitive in the DPRK, but the system is different because there is a process by which mass organizations, the party, which also reflects a broad base of people, nominates and selects single candidates based on ongoing discussion about what is needed and who is best to sort of rise to those occasions. So the election itself, the actual process of voting, is more about ratifying that decision rather than being the be-all, end-all of making the choice of who's going to assume office. And so because the whole of society is already involved in governance at different levels, there's a lot less pressure on the election as the sole kind of outlet for democratic expression. And, I can get a little bit more into the structure of how, the DPRK works as a political system. I am seeing like a lot of thinking gestures from you. So I don't know if you have a follow-up question you wanted to ask.
Well, so from what it sounds like to me is that it is, as far as, let me ask this one question first, a follow-up question. Would the person who is in the governing structure, do they decide themselves to run for office and then get chosen by the people? Or is it kind of like here in the United States, Socialist Alternative, where they say, you're going to be our guy and we nominate you no matter if you sought it out or not? Is it kind of like that?
Yeah, it's more of the second process. I think I don't know like all the details of every single person who's been nominated. Maybe some of them have nominated themselves. I'm not clear on that. But generally speaking, because it's a collective process, it's not about like, whoever says they want to be, in a certain position and those are the only people we consider, right? It's much more of a process where the actual relevant local organs and mass organizations sit down and they're like, all right, what does this position require? Who are the leaders in our society who can be entrusted with these responsibilities, right? And when I say leaders, I mean, these are people who, leaders make themselves apparent in a society, right? When, you have like a real like social process, like there are people who like take on more responsibility than others, who demonstrate, strength of character, other things that would make people want them to be in an official position. So I think that's sort of the best way I can respond to your question.
Okay, so this reminds me of one time. This was the cool part. So I used to work for a furniture store. Mm-hmm. We were all sales associates, and we didn't have. I think we needed a manager, and we were in the process in between of getting a manager to the store. So we needed somebody to help manage the store in the meantime. And we all said, "Hey, we think it should be so and so." And then everybody started saying, "Yeah, we all like him. He's a great guy. He's been in this business for 20 something years, and we all have a great rapport with him." So we all just out of the blue just chose him, right? Yeah. It was basically like, "Hey, you've been chosen to serve," and he's like, "If you guys want me, okay." And it was like, and it worked out so well because we chose him. He didn't even say, "Oh, I'll do it." We were like, "No, you're going to do it." And it was great. And that's what it sounds like it is in DPRK.
Yeah, I think, that's a very apt sort of comparison, right? And I think, like when leadership is based on that, it's much better than like when you just have these people that are always like maneuvering and scheming to like try to like, work their way to the top, whether that's like at a company or in like, formal political office and things of that nature. To get a little bit into like the actual structure of the system, basically the way that it works is that there are people's assemblies at all levels of the society, from like your local municipality to like neighborhoods and big cities, all the way to the national organ, which is called the Supreme People's Assembly. And this is actually the highest organ of state power. So the highest organ of state power in the DPRK is the legislature. And those deputies are elected for 4 years. They don't receive a salary and they actually continue with their previous jobs. So they don't like form this class of, like Nancy Pelosi's and other people who become like professional politicos, right? And they're also subject to immediate recall, which is different than the way the U.S. works. Like you can't recall a senator in the U.S., right? That's how you end up with like John Fetterman's, who like, was elected by people who wanted a liberal senator and is very clearly not acting like one, right? And so, the SPA, the Supreme People's Assembly, as, the highest authority, also holds responsibilities like appointing the Supreme Court and also electing the State Affairs Commission, the chairman of which is Kim Jong-un. And so what that means is that Kim Jong-un does have a boss. It is, the Supreme People's Assembly. And, the body that he oversees, the State Affairs Commission, is only the highest policy body. But its authority derives still from the legislature. So what that means is that he doesn't have a body that can enact its own laws, right? They can make suggestions, they can put items on the agenda for the Supreme People's Assembly to consider. But they can't just unilaterally go out and say, this is the way things are, right? Outside the realm of policy decisions that are within their authority as the executive. So that's just kind of a basic sketch of, how the actual political system works. And, we could break into that a bit more, but I know you have other questions. So,
yeah. So the supreme leader of the DPRK is the people, and the person who kind of coordinates is the person that they're like, okay, Kim Jong-un, you're coordinating for us.
I think that's a pretty good description of it. Supreme leader is a title that Kim Jong-un holds. But then, the authority that he has, what I'm saying is the authority is not actually absolute, right? It's not all areas of government that he himself is able to personally change, right? Of course, he's very influential, right? He can make recommendations, he can, maneuver politically to get things done. But then according to like the way the government is actually structured, it's the legislature that holds that supreme authority.
Okay. Thank you so very much for that. Due to the sake of time, and because I have dude, you just brought up a million more questions in my head. This is so fascinating, but I also want to be respectful of your time because I know you're a very busy person, so I got to be respectful. But my next question is there homelessness in DPRK? And if so, is there a rate of homelessness that can be measured? And is there home ownership?
So these are all really great questions. I think when it comes to the issue of homelessness and housing, the sort of immediate response I can give is, well, there isn't like a rate of homelessness that's like published. So I can't give you statistics and figures, but I can describe the way that property ownership works and sort of the different dynamics that may or may not lead to the existence or non-existence of homelessness. So to begin with, housing is guaranteed as a constitutional right in the DPRK.
Constitutional right.
Yeah, it's a constitutional right. And as part of that, because it's also a socialist system, what that means is that real estate land is not commodified. You can't buy and sell and accumulate homes as a private individual or entity the way that you can in a capitalist system. People do acquire personal property based on their contributions to cooperative work, based on basically like how much they've given to the society, but there's limits to how much they can own in terms of land. And so as to the existence of homelessness, I think there's a couple of conditions to consider. The first is that, the DPRK has been hit by some pretty severe climate disasters, especially in its recent history. And I think in those situations, we can say that, yeah, there are people who become effectively homeless because their home was washed away by a flood or something of that nature, right? But the way that this is handled in the DPRK is very, very different than in other places. For instance, there was major flooding in North Pyongan province this year, and there were thousands of people who had to be relocated, but they're being sheltered in the capital. Right. And so, they're not in their own like personal home the way they were when like before the floods happened. But, they're in this kind of transitional state where like they have to wait for the new housing to be constructed in order to have that in the first place. Right. Another dynamic I think to consider is that, the DPRK, Korean culture places a lot of emphasis on like kind of staying within the family, even as an adult. Right. This is also common in South Korea, where like you become an adult, your parents don't kick you out, you stay with them until you get married, right? And in a lot of cases, you get married and then you just keep living with your parents. But, you know, if there is strife within a family, I could see scenarios where like people, you know, feel they have to leave, right? But I think what we can effectively say is that there is not strong evidence of a permanent class of homeless people in the DPRK, like there you find in a lot of capitalist countries, right? Particularly in the United States. And that's because, you know, the property relations that determine housing are so different. You know, for all the reasons that I just described. And, you know, the government also places a huge emphasis on ensuring that there is a consistent supply of modern housing available to people. That's actually one of the chief priorities of the DPRK right now, and it has been for the last few years, to build 50,000 modern apartments in Pyongyang, which will be free, you know, for the workers that receive them. And then there are corresponding initiatives that are being undertaken in rural areas to also make sure that not only does everyone have housing, but that this housing, you know, is fit for the conditions of human beings, and that, you know, it is, you know, modern up to a certain standard, and that, you know, people can expect to have things like electricity, you know, like clean running water, et cetera, et cetera.
Wow, wow, wow. And just thinking about, because there will be people who will say things about, especially when they're talking about China, they'll be like, oh my God, they got cities where buildings where they don't have anybody inhabiting them. And my thing goes, well, we have 16 million vacant homes here in the United States.
Yeah.
And we literally have homeless people. But let China or DPRK have cities empty with buildings, but they have no homelessness because they're preparing for future people to move into them as the population grows. That sounds more logical to me than what we have here in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's a planned economy, right? So the needs of housing are not about what's going to make BlackRock the most money, right? What's going to make, you know, this or that millionaire developer even more rich. It's around how many people do we have, and how many houses do they need to, you know, achieve a certain standard of living that's within the kind of like cultural norms of the society.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's pretty awesome. I'm not gonna lie. And as somebody that knows what it's like to be homeless and knows what homelessness feels like, even as a child, just to be able to, I don't know, just got to be some really deep sense of security, and it's got to be a culture shock. Like if I were somebody that moved from the DPRK and having that life and then move here to the States, it would be a shock to my system just to know what homelessness feels like. It would.
Right.
It would rattle me.
Yeah, even from some other capitalist countries. I mean, like Europeans or like South Koreans, Japanese, they come to the US and like, oh my God, what are you guys doing? What's going on? Right? Because it's so apparent and it's so glaring, right? And I mean, like, it's just something we're forced to accept as normal, but like, why should the daily grinding suffering of our fellow human beings be something that we ever accept, right? I mean, it's a crying shame that, you know, I mean, I live in New York, and like, I forget the exact figure, but it's something like over 100,000 children in the public school system that experience homelessness at some point in the academic year. I mean, this is the city with the most like billionaires on the planet, and this is the condition that we're allowing children to grow up in. I mean, that's just unacceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel you there. I also want to move on to my next question about, does DPRK have universal health care? And do they provide healthcare to foreigners or for free, or do they have to pay?
So healthcare is another right guaranteed under the Constitution. And the healthcare system has actually been praised by international bodies like the World Health Organization. So you don't have to like take my word for it in terms of what the standard of healthcare that's offered is. There are international bodies, you know, under the UN, which is not always a friendly organization to North Korea, that, you know, corroborates this, right? That doesn't mean that the healthcare system doesn't face challenges, right? Particularly under sanctions. So a lot of medical equipment, for instance, can't be imported into the DPRK because it's classified under something that's called dual use. And what that means is that, according to the sanctions writers, these items could potentially have civilian and military applications. But there's a very intentionally wide definition that's used, and it ends up creating problems for the DPRK. For instance, things like catheters, syringes, X-ray machines, MRIs, these are all classified as dual use. under the sanctions regime. So the DPRK actually can't import them. If they want these things, they have to develop them on their own. And there is a report from the organization Korea Peace Now that was written studying, the effects of sanctions solely in the year 2018, only looking at the impact on UN health programs. And it concluded that close to 4,000 people died in that year because of delays and disruptions to the healthcare system that were caused by these sanctions. And the majority of those people were children under the age of 5. So, the healthcare system in the DPRK is not perfect, but it's way more advanced and it's way more universal than you will find certainly in countries that have a similar level of GDP. There's a scene from the documentary Crossings where, all these different women's leaders from around the world went to the DPRK. One of them was from Liberia, right? And they visited a hospital. It's actually I found this a little bit humorous because there were a number of, Americans who were on the trip as well, and they were kind of just on edge the entire time, and you could see it from the way they were conducting themselves on camera. But then this Liberian woman, they visited this NICU, right? This ICU for infants, and she was enthralled. She was watching as they were taking care of a premature baby and things like that, using standards of medical health that I think is very, very difficult to find in the global South generally, right? So I think that speaks to kind of what has managed to be achieved in the DPRK in spite of all of these things. I would also point out, the DPRK has historically shared some of this expertise with the world. They actually, North Korean doctors played a huge role in revolutionary Mozambique and helping to build the healthcare system there. Now, as to your question about foreigners, I actually don't know what happens if you're a foreigner and you go to the DPRK and you need healthcare. So I can't answer the question with full accuracy. I don't think they would just let you die. But if you were planning to go there for medical tourism reasons, maybe that is not, maybe you'll need to find more information before you make that decision.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about how it's difficult for countries like Cuba because of the embargo. Mm-hmm. Because right. of the sanctions that are happening there. And it makes it a lot more difficult, even when it comes to medical services for them to be able to do for their people, really, because the United States is, murdering their population by proxy. Mm-hmm. And as far as, foreigners, of course, if I were to go to another country for medical treatment, I'd probably go to China because I don't want to help exhaust the needs of the medical system in a place like DPRK, because it's I want to make sure that their people, is reserved for their people so that they don't exhaust, because it is easily exhaustible because of what the United States and the West is really doing there. So, of course, even though I would love to be able to get my dialysis there while visiting, I'm not going to be able to, but it's all good. I'll go after transplant. But yeah, so thank you very much for that. Of course, that was kind of an easy question because it's North Korea, do they have universal healthcare? It's kind of duh. But my next question is, are North Koreans allowed to go to websites outside of the DPRK like Chinese citizens? If yes, are they advised to use a VPN?
So this is a really interesting question, and it's something that I think is kind of shifting a lot, particularly in recent years. So I'm going with the information I have, but I'll add the caveat that, I think this is one of the things about the DPRK that's the hardest to know from the outside. And so part of the reason is because the DPRK has an infranet, not internet. By that, I mean it's not connected to the wider global internet system. And the reason for that is, very similar to why, countries like China have the Great Firewall, or why, Cuba, was not permitting the use of certain social media sites for a while. And it's because these global telecommunications are dominated by the US, right? It's US companies, it's US technology, it's US infrastructure in terms of the fiber optic cables that are running everywhere. So the DPRK, has sought to create their own system, and that's, both to guard against information warfare, but also cyber warfare. An example of that is, I think in the Bush or Obama years, there was something called the Stuxnet virus, which was developed by the US and Israel to specifically attack the DPRK and Iran, right? So they're not just being paranoid here. They are responding to a real threat environment, right? Which they have experience with. As to the use of VPNs, I've come across some reports from Western tech companies that indicate that they have found VPN IPs from the DPRK. The reason for that is because there's been some investigations into companies that have inadvertently ended up hiring DPRK firms who have, presented themselves as not being in the DPRK, probably using some of these VPNs. But the reason why, those firms are doing that is because they're trying to get around the sanctions regime. They're trying to find ways to, still conduct commerce and, support the economy in the DPRK. Now, when it comes to individual access and use of the internet, I think it's safe to say that it's not universal. And I think the biggest barrier there is actually still sanctions, actually still these conditions of war, because you have to remember the DPRK can't just start importing Apple iPhones tomorrow, right? They're blocked from doing that. So if they want to create smartphones, they want computers, they basically have to make them on their own. Maybe counting on some components from other countries, but a lot of it is going to have to come from them, right? And so what that means is that, not everyone is going to have a personal electronic device in the way that we're used to seeing in a country like the United States, right? Like people aren't going to have a laptop and a phone and a tablet, right? Smartphones are becoming more common, but I think, personal computers are still not really a thing for most people. So what that means is that if people are going to access, the web in the DPRK, they're going to do it through work at a work computer that's physically at the office, or through school, at a university library, something of that nature. There's also an initiative now to build what's being called sci-tech centers around the country. And these are places where people can come for cultural enrichment, access to research and education, which includes, access to the web and to computers, and also receiving training on, how to use that kind of technology. So I think it's something that will change in the coming years, but for now, it's probably not the case that every single person in the DPRK can go on the internet whenever they want to, but a lot of that has to do with the actual conditions of the DPRK at this time.
Yeah, because it sounds like just more further expanded libraries like what we have here. It's just, we have media centers and things like that as well as here too. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, pretty cool. I mean, trying to do what they can for this, to help people embrace technology without risking their state or the people at all. I get it. So another one is that I have is, does DPRK have mandatory military service or conscription?
They do. And military service is mandatory for all able-bodied citizens. It can last up to 10 years for men and up to 8 years for women. And, that is a long time, but the length of the service actually depends on the specific roles and duties that individuals adopt. Also, the needs of the country at different times. So I believe, there are some changes that sometimes happen in terms of, how long this conscription lasts. The DPRK also has armed citizens militias, similar to the, Committee to Defend the Revolution in Cuba. And, these are groups that organize for the defense at the local level. And so what that means is that functionally the entire citizenry is trained in the use of weapons and has reasonable access to them, right? It's not necessarily people having individual huge gun collections, but there are armories and stuff like that. It's publicly known where they are, how to access them, who kind of monitors what goes in and out of there. And I think that's important to understand understand the nature of that conscription and how it really works in the DPRK. And one thing I would add is that conscription it's an inter-Korean reality. In South Korea, there's mandatory conscription. It is shorter. It does, apply only to men. But, the condition that's driving this is the unfinished Korean War, right? The Korean War, there was an armistice in 1953. There has never been a conclusive peace agreement. So all the parties that are involved in that war are legally still at war, right? And so for North Korea, they have to take this very, very seriously because they are the ones who paid the most dearly in that war, right? There were something like 3 to 5 million people that died in the Korean War. And it's generally acknowledged that more than half of that figure was from the DPRK alone. I could get into the severity of the war crimes that the US was enacting in North Korea. I think, honestly, that would take a little too long and frankly be a little bit too personally upsetting. But, I think what we can say is that, the DPRK continues to face constant threats, right? In 2023, the US had more than 200 days of war games in Korea, right? So more than half the year, they're conducting some kind of military exercise that has some application to a war with North Korea, right? And this year, they also began rehearsing plans for how they would coordinate a nuclear strike on Korea. So these are the threats that the DPRK is facing directly. And they're also looking around the world at Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Palestine, Syria, Libya, Somalia. We could go on, right? And so they understand that the threat of US imperialism is very, very real. So it is something that they take seriously. And I think that is, something that is kind of throughout the society, because even if you're a person in the DPRK who may have some issues with your government, that does not mean that you want to see your home city burned to the ground by US bombers, right? So self-defense and national defense are things that, are very, very top priority for the government and for the people.
Yeah. So it kind of, don't make this too funny, but it's kind of funny how first of all, the United States wants to do to DPRK what they did to Libya. This is why DPRK is like, no, we're going to have a nuke because you guys aren't messing with us. And another thing is like, we as Americans do not want to mess with DPRK, because if everybody's conscripted, that means men and women, and that means that everybody knows how to carry a peace. That means it behooves us to not go to war with a country like that, because they will kick our asses. So it's just hilarious to me. Like, they will demonize this country, and meanwhile, it's like they know how to fight. Why are we having bad relations with them in the first place? Like, we need to be diplomatic. It's weird how and I do not like Donald Trump at all, but him trying to soften relations with the DPRK, I actually think is a good thing to do.
Yeah, I think everything you're saying is exactly right. They do this thing in US media where they always present a US enemy as both diabolically evil and powerful, and like completely weak and flimsy, right? Logically, it doesn't hold, right? You can't say that something is a global threat and also that, they pose no threat at the same time, right? I think what we can say is the DPRK has very, very powerful military capabilities. It's also a society where the entire population is prepared to engage in self-defense, right? And not just like mentally, like they know how to operate the weaponry. They know how to coordinate themselves, in units in order to effectively fight back. What that means is that in any situation of US invasion, there's going to be huge casualties, both for like the invading US force and for, the domestic population. And so this is a war we have to be avoiding by all means, just for the very basic human reason that millions of people should not die, for no like real gain to humanity. Right. And I think that, I agree, like any measures that are taken by US leaders to try to reduce tensions with the DPRK are a good thing and should be supported.
Yeah, thank you. My next question is college education free, or do citizens have to pay a tuition?
Education is also guaranteed under the Constitution. There's no private like education system, there aren't like alternate schools that, you have to like pay to get into. There aren't like these like big like ed tech companies or things of that nature that are, like siphoning money off of the public system and things like that. You are guaranteed a universal education up to the equivalent of like a high school diploma. And then, the majority of people then by that point have either like determined, what industry they're going to go into and then kind of like go into that, or they receive continuing education in the form of college or more advanced degrees. If, like that is the path for them. Right. And I think there's a lot of like interesting things about the way the education system works. For instance, like basically everyone receives some level of technical training before they even graduate college. So what that means is that as like a teenager, how like the local industries in your community work. You have some sense of like what the real world and the economy is like. And you can actually start thinking as an adolescent, like, where do I want to fit in to like the grander society? Now, of course, teenagers in America also work, but you do that on top of school. It's not part of school, right? So, you know, it is a different system, and it's more geared towards like actually trying to help people like find, you know, their place in life, rather than, being forced into a situation where you have to work because, like, you know, your parents aren't making enough, you have to help support around the house, you have personal things that you want, which, you know, your family can't provide for, things of that nature.
Wow, that's pretty awesome. Is school year round, or do they have like summer breaks like we do?
I'm actually not sure about that. I would need to check, but
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, I would imagine it's probably more year round, especially because you know, they have cold winters there in DPRK. So,
Yeah,
would
generally in South Korea, at least, like the winter break is the longer break.
Yeah,
because it's like, you know, it's just more logical in like a temperate climate. Like, why pay to keep the school warm when you could just have the kids at school during the summer? So, yeah.
basically, yeah. Thank you so much. Now, this is one of the fun questions I wanted to know. Is marijuana legal or decriminalized in things like alcohol, tobacco, and other substances?
So alcohol and tobacco are legal. Tobacco is like very commonly grown. You go to even South Korea, everyone's smoking, or I guess they're vaping now, but, you know, tobacco consumption is a big part of our culture. It's got its positives and its negatives. For anyone listening who is not a smoker, more negatives. Don't start because, you know, I gave this interview. I have read some tourist accounts of smoking hemp flower. And, you know, hemp has many, many uses, right? It's related to the kind of like commercial cannabis plant that, you know, people use to get high. In terms of like, is there like a consistently strong culture of like smoking like marijuana that is like similar to what you would find in the West? I find that a little bit difficult to say. There is like testament from like even like from like previous centuries of, you know, Koreans, you know, smoking some marijuana, but I don't think that like what is grown is like so potent that like it's necessarily seen in the same like recreational way.
Okay.
I've never tried it myself in North Korea, so I can't speak to the quality of it by any means. But, you know, I think it's just kind of a little bit of a different history in terms of like the relationship to the plant family, and I think that kind of like structures the way things work. And I think also, you know, the culture around drug consumption in East Asia differently is pretty distinct, has, or at least traditionally has been. And, you know, I think in North Korea, I would venture to guess that it's probably not something that is like encouraged or something I would necessarily tell people, oh yeah, go there and try that. I don't think it's something that like is being super heavily monitored, but, you know, it's also just the sort of thing where like you don't really know like the full context around it. And, you know, I wouldn't say that the DPRK will be the next great cannabis tourism destination.
Yeah. I heard that it's not illegal, but it's not legal. It's just kind of like not even really thought of that much. I don't know, but I hope to be able to visit one day. You know, just to ask around. You know, just to see. But my next question is: what's the relationship with South Korea like? You know, at one point a decade ago, there were talks about reconciliation, reunification, when the South had left-leaning leader, and especially what's going on now with President Yoon, where he tried to do a martial law, a call for martial law. So, what is it like?
Yeah, so relations right now are at a historic low. Probably the worst they've been since the Korean War armistice. So I need to start with that. And I think, you know, we can say this is pretty much entirely because of the Yoon administration in South Korea and their backers in Washington, right? There's details coming out today in the South Korean parliament, and these have not been corroborated and fully confirmed yet. I do want to start with that kind of disclaimer, but, you know, according to what is being heard, you know, in the National Assembly right now, there may have been a plot to effectively create like a false flag operation to make it look like there was a North Korean attack. or to find some way to justify an attack on North Korea as part of the overall coup plans, right? If everything had gone according to the way that President Yoon wanted it to. So, things are very, very bad in terms of the inter-Korean relationship right now, and a lot of it has to do with the current government, which I need to point out. 13% approval rating for this president. So this man does not have any kind of basis of political legitimacy from his society. It's coming from US imperialism. That's why he's been able to kind of like stay in power for even this long, right?
Yeah.
Now, to get into the more general question, I think, to start, the thing to understand about Korea in general is that there really is just one national identity. And that is something that makes Korea unique in the world, given its history, because prior to the division of Korea, which was a decision made by the United States, not by Korean people, the peninsula was territorially united for at least 1,000 years. Korea also doesn't have like these huge linguistic differences that you might find in a lot of other countries. There is some scholarly debate about like, do certain dialects, particularly the language spoken on Jeju Island, are they technically distinct languages? But it's not the same as, say, in like Spain, where you have like Basque and Catalan and, Castilian and other languages that, like are not actually mutually intelligible, are very, obviously distinct languages and things like that. So Koreans have been one people with more or less one language and a contiguous national culture for a very long time. And, dividing Korea was never something that the majority of Korean people supported. So the DPRK's policy from the 1970s until actually this year to pursue peaceful reunification with the South on an independent basis, meaning they were in support of a process that would be led by Koreans, decided by Koreans, and would not involve foreign actors. And things have changed a lot because of the events of the last 10 years. The failure of the Trump-Kim dialogues really showed the DPRK that diplomacy with the US is a dead end, right? And then once Yoon Suk-yeol came into power in 2022, things really, really turned bad very quickly. He's done a lot to destroy relationships between the two Korean governments. Last year, he declared that the DPRK is South Korea's so-called main enemy, which is just like, what are you doing as a country saying you have a main enemy? What does that mean? This is not like some kind of children's show or something. And so, the DPRK has responded in kind and also classified the Republic of Korea, South Korea, as a hostile state. So this is a very tense situation. It's a really heartbreaking situation. I think what it shows at the end of the day is what a huge barrier US imperialism is to peace and reconciliation in Korea, and how imperative it is that, Korean people need to be fighting against imperialism. We need to be struggling to actually have sovereignty, in our country, because that's not something that, exists in South Korea, at least right now. And that's a huge part of the equation in terms of what is, a politically possible future. And part of an organization called Norutol that recently launched a US Out of Korea campaign. I would really recommend people check it out. You can go to usoutofkorea.org to read more about our demands and stay up to date with what we're doing. But this is something that, I think is very, very important and actually really needs to be addressed, because, the closer Korea gets to war, the closer not only the US gets to another war in Asia, but actually the world, because China is right next door. Russia is right next door, right? And we know that East Asia is a place where imperialists are looking to start another front in what is already quickly devolving into World War III vis-a-vis the Middle East and Ukraine, right? So this is one area where there's a lot going on in the world right now, but we do need to keep our eye on the ball in order to help preserve some prospects of peace out of this very, very ugly global situation that we're in.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much for that and saying that, because that this is why we're trying to change the system from the inside, because the empire is just getting too radical in a fascistic direction, all over the world. One of my final questions is, what's the PRK's level of interest in BRICS? Would there be political implications of what would be the political implications of DPRK potentially joining BRICS? And would there be any objections from BRICS countries?
I think this is a really interesting question. The DPRK is in a position now where they are actively seeking stronger ties with the wider world. Since the 90s, they've suffered a lot of isolation because of US domination of the international system, because of US sanctions. The US really can't enforce those sanctions anymore, right? Particularly after trying to sanction Russia. Russia's right next door to the DPRK. Now they're in a strategic partnership, right? So what that indicates is that, you know, there's more and more opportunities that are being created for the DPRK to engage in exchanges with the wider world. And I think as those efforts continue, we will see a huge transformation take place, particularly in the next 10 to 20 years, I would say. You know, I'm willing to, you know, stake a lot of things on that. I say, come back in a decade or two, we're going to be talking about a very different country. Now, the DPRK has not actually expressed interest in joining BRICS. And, you know, I think there are several potential explanations for that. They haven't been very clear about what that logic is, but I think that from their standpoint, it is more important for them to build bilateral relations with key partners who can help them with their actual immediate needs, right? Rather than joining like this big sort of dialogue like BRICS, which is made up of many, many different kinds of countries, not all of which are really that committed to, you know, engaging in any kind of anti-imperialist front, right? And I think an example of that is, you know, Venezuela was recently vetoed from joining BRICS, right, as a result of the bill. So I think, you know, that there's probably some anticipation, particularly after that the DPRK would face similar barriers. That doesn't mean that the DPRK can't benefit from BRICS and other processes, even if it isn't formally a part of it. For instance, they're talking about the formation of eventually having a BRICS currency. If that were to come to pass, I think that could be very beneficial. I think even the kind of like bilateral trade relations that are building up, which are circumventing the dollar, particularly among BRICS nations, also helps the DPRK because that creates precedent. It establishes, you know, other platforms by which the DPRK can engage in international trade. Right now, the DPRK cannot trade in US dollars, and US dollars have been the dominant form of international trade for many, many decades. So that functionally means that, you know, even if they're trying to do trade with countries that don't use the dollar as their national currency, they've been obstructed from being able to do that. So as, you know, that kind of dollar-dominated system declines, there are more opportunities that are opening up for the DPRK, regardless of whether it's formally a member of BRICS or not.
Okay, thank you very much for that. The final question I have is, DPRK does not recognize the state of Israel. What actions had DPRK taken to oppose, resist, and stop the genocide in Gaza?
I think this is a great question. It's actually one of my favorite topics to research and talk about, particularly in the last year. So the DPRK, you know, has a very long-standing relationship with the Palestinian Liberation Movement. They've never recognized the Zionist entity as a legitimate state. And they're one of the very few countries outside of the Arab and Muslim world that have, you know, upheld this position. I believe it's only really Cuba, maybe also Venezuela or Nicaragua that have, you know, maintained that stand. So in terms of the current situation, they've repeatedly denounced the genocide in Gaza. There are a lot of reports from US and Israeli military experts claiming that a number of arms that are being used by the Palestinian resistance are of DPRK origin. I myself am not a military expert, so I can't really, you know, corroborate that one way or another. But, you know, there's a historic relationship here, right? And the DPRK has been very friendly to the PLO, the PFLP, other Palestinian factions, and has not only provided them with diplomatic support, but with material support, right? There's a number of leaders, Palestinian leaders, who have visited the DPRK. And so this is a very long-standing and deep relationship in a lot of ways. And it's part of a consistent pattern of the DPRK's historical support for anti-colonial struggles around the world. Examples of that include, you know, Vietnam during, as they were repelling the US invasion. The DPRK also supported Mozambique and Angola in terms of providing training, in terms of providing supplies in the struggle against Portugal. They did the same thing with the ANC in South Africa, with SWAPO in Namibia, and with, you know, Zimbabwe in the struggle against apartheid and against Rhodesia. They were also part of the non-aligned movement. They've given economic assistance to countries like Grenada and Malta. So they have a very long history of this kind of engagement with the wider world. It runs very, very counter to this narrative of the DPRK as this kind of hermit kingdom that intentionally seals itself off from the world. I think a better way to look at it is that the US has done everything possible to isolate and limit the DPRK's contact with the wider world because they don't like the way that they engage on the world stage. And I think a last point is that, the DPRK has also supported the Palestinian movement indirectly through its relationships within the resistance axis. And it's actually played a very important role in developing the military capabilities of a lot of these actors, including Iran, including Hezbollah as well. It's believed, for instance, that Hezbollah has this massive tunnel network in South Lebanon, right? Korea needed to develop a similar tunnel network during the Korean War, right? I'm not totally clear on the history of this, but I believe that, it is one of the first places where the strategy was pursued to the extent that it was in the face of an imperialist conflict, right? And so what the DPRK has done since then is not only build on that technical know-how, but actually helped to export it to other contexts. They played a huge role in developing the underground infrastructure of Vietnam during the Vietnam War, for instance. And it's believed that, they've done the same thing in Lebanon as well. And if that's the case, that probably means that there is some kind of indirect relationship to the tunnel network that's also being used by the resistance in Gaza. So the DPRK, has played all these different kinds of roles when it comes to the Palestinian movement, and it's part of its, contribution to the global anti-imperialist struggle, right? They're not purely doing this out of reasons of interest, but also of ideology, because fundamentally the DPRK is a revolutionary state that wants to see the defeat of imperialism at the world level.
Yeah. I honestly wish that China would take more of the DPRK stance when it comes to the Zionist state of Israel and supporting the Palestinian people, because I feel like they could do better. I would like to see it, copy what DPRK is doing in that regard too. So I just want to thank you for that. And I have went over the amount of time that I promised you. I promised you 45 minutes. We went over.
Really great conversation. And I mean, to add to that final point, I think, I think we all wish that there was a stronger anti-imperialist force in the world, and we often look to China to play that role. I think part of what we're looking at is that China and North Korea, despite having been so close and undergone a lot of the same experiences, are in very, very different positions on the world stage today, right? And I think, there's a moral case to be made, and I would agree with it, that, we should all be doing everything possible for Palestine. But I think, it's also part of having a materialist analysis to look at the reality of our world today and understand that, different actors are taking different actions depending on the differences in their conditions, both where they're placed in the world and, what's going on internally. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for joining. And I appreciate, it was a privilege to have you on, to be educated, be educated along with my audience. And thank you so very much for being very generous with your time and answering these questions in a very nuanced way, because a lot of times nuance isn't very popular here in the West, so I appreciate it so much. And also, if you can let people know where they can find you and how they can support your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I'll plug Norutol and the US Out of Korea campaign one more time. That's usoutofkorea.org, and you can find the organization on most social media. That's at NODUTDOL, at NODUTDOL. You can also, follow me on Twitter. My handle is hermit_Hwarang. Hwarang is spelled HWARANG. And yeah, thanks so much again for having me on. This has been an excellent time. And, I hope we can do this again soon.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Ju-hyun Park, thank you so much for joining.
Yep. Thank you. Have a good day.
All right. Have a good day. Bye-bye. Thank you so very much for watching my channel, and I deeply appreciate it from the top and bottom of my heart. If you wish to support the channel further, so I can keep bringing you content that is educational and informative, you can become a patron on patreon.com/Jaybefaunt. You can find that link in the pinned comment or in the description below. No matter what you give, you'll be supporting independent media and education that helps make the world better. Thank you so much, and you can watch more of my content here. Mwah! Forehead kisses, and have a beautiful day.